really giving students an opportunity to be present, to be seen, to fill up a space, to be heard, is really, really important because it means that they're engaging with the learning, even if they can't engage in the target language just yet, right? Otherwise, what we end up creating is these spaces where students are being left behind linguistically and academically.
We have a lot to go over, both big picture and also some very specific questions. But I wanted to begin by talking a little bit more about family engagement. And Maria, beginning with you, your book, Mothering Labeled Children, really centers the experiences of Latinx mothers who are raising children who are both emergent bilingual and also labeled as disabled. So I was hoping you could start us off by telling us a little bit more about your book, about these mothers, and also some recommendations you have for teachers for being effective partners with these mothers.
Yeah, thanks. So the book is really, I think, I haven't really described it this way before, but it's a love letter to all the moms that I worked with, and all the families that I worked with as a bilingual special education teacher. Because I think as a teacher, I was receiving a very different kind of messaging about who these women were and how they weren't showing up and what that meant, than what I had experienced myself as a child, right, of an immigrant mother. So I immigrated with my mom when I was 6 years old. And I saw the way people talked about my mom, but I also understood the ways my mom was engaging. And I was a child who was classified as having come here from another country as well, right? So I had been identified as an English language learner and I had been identified as having disabilities, but they didn't impact my school, right? Any of my schooling. So I think that also shaped a lot of what my experience was and what my mom's experience was, right? So rather than falling into special education channels, I was in gifted and talented channels, right? But we know that that's, two ends of the same spectrum kind of to think about it, and that a lot of students in gifted and talented programs are actually also dually identified as gifted and talented and having disabilities. So this book is really a way to understand the nuances that families are negotiating with, particularly immigrant families from Latin America. I wasn't intending to, but the book centers around predominantly undocumented women. And so I think that also gave an understanding to what their particular experiences were like, and that this data was collected in the wake of the 2016, right, 2017 election. So there's a lot for me that also feels like I'm repeating and re-understanding. And so the book really aims to give teachers an understanding of what these families are negotiating when they're not at school. And it also gives families an understanding, and mothers particularly an understanding, of what of what their rights are and kind of things to pay attention to, and ways to engage. I think that answered. Yes?
Yes.
I'm sorry, the book is not available for free in English yet because I had to work with a publisher, and not all things are possible, even though we can dream of them someday. Uh,
Someday.
Someday. So in terms of strategies for teachers, I think that was the second part of your question. I feel like in listening to Esther talk, and in seeing this huge audience of participants, right, is we are all interested in community. And so our students are interested in seeking community, teachers are interested in seeking community, and so are parents. And so if we really understood that and approached some of the pedagogical challenges that we have from that lens, I think it would be different. So having said that, I think teachers really need to work collaboratively together. I remember working across grade teams and being able to just think together about different strategies to support our learners, right? I had been a classroom teacher, for example, who had been trained in translanguaging theory at one point, and I became really good colleagues with someone who knew a lot about universal design for learning, right? And it was through that exchange that I was able to develop and kind of understand what are the similarities between a translanguaging framework, right, that thinks about how to create language access, and what are the similarities with a universal design for learning framework, right, which is trying to create access to learning. And so I looked at those things as a teacher and thought about, okay, well, what are the points where I can find connection? And I'm going to focus on that, right? And I'm going to focus on preparing my lessons to be accessible so that I'm creating multiple means of representation, right? So I'm going to have my lessons available in English and Spanish, but I'm also going to make them available in video, right? And I'm going to make the preview of the class be a video, but then we'll do the engagement, be a conversation so that everything isn't really dependent on the same language systems or even on the same learning strategies. Um, and I think as teachers, if we trust ourselves and if we are given and take enough time, right, to focus on learning certain disciplines and certain practices, right, we can really start then to notice, well, what are the things that I need to change in order to support my learners, and how do I do that? Well, linguistically, I know that second language acquisition, translanguaging theory, those offer me options. And then academically, right, I know that universal design for learning can offer me some options, but so does culturally relevant pedagogies, right? So really just thinking about what do you have available to you, what services, what curriculums are you being introduced to or mandated or asked to, right, to hold on to, and then what are the cracks, right, where you can maybe plant something more robust than what exists there. I wrote an entire article about at least translanguaging and UDL and that framework that I call TrueDL, and those things are available for free. So any article that I've ever written is available for free on my website. You just click on the title and you'll get a PDF of that. And it kind of walks you through just what does that aligning process look like. And it's not necessarily that I think it has to be true to Yale, right? But that one of the ways that we can reduce our threshold as educators is looking at how curriculum align and how practices align so that we can engage more effectively.
Yeah, that's great. If you could speak a little more, a question we often get from teachers is maybe they only speak one language. Maybe they have students from many different countries coming into their school, speaking many different languages. What advice would you have for teachers in those situations?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really hard is that I remember at least from my training as a teacher, there was so much focus on classroom management, right? And part of classroom management to me was control. And I think the advice that I have that I most often give is that we have to release some control and trust that our students are actually being on task, right? So I think giving our students engaging activities, but allowing them to engage in those in their home languages, more often than not, the students are doing the task, right? They're not really distracted. We know when students are distracted when they're speaking in English, right? We know when they're distracted when they're not speaking at all. So I think really giving students an opportunity to be present, to be seen, to fill up a space, to be heard, is really, really important because it means that they're engaging with the learning, even if they can't engage in the target language just yet, right? Otherwise, what we end up creating is these spaces where students are being left behind linguistically and academically.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That's so helpful. I want to turn back to Diana for a moment and thinking more about evaluation, because I know we had a lot of questions ahead of time about that. We also have a lot more coming in now. And I guess to combine a few, and this could, yes.
Oh, sorry. You had previously sent us things, and there was someone who had mentioned something about a particular student and how they were concerned about evaluation and delaying special education evaluation in the interest of giving students more time to be here. And I wanted to address that before you turn to Diana on evaluation, because I think it's one of the places where we get stuck believing that we're being kind or generous to our learners, but we're actually potentially doing harm. Um, So, according to Child Find, it is our responsibility to have students identified, assessed, and evaluated as soon as possible. And the reason why we do that is because the research shows that early intervention is the most important form of intervention, right? So the sooner we can get students to services, the better. Sending students for evaluation does not guarantee that they will be put into special education, right? And so we have to recognize that distinction. One. I think two, we have to recognize how we perpetuate stigma when we try to delay students from these services, because then we're saying some kids deserve to be there, but other kids don't deserve to be there. And it might be because of this and it might be because of that, right? But if we suspect and understand that a student isn't making growth or progress, it's our responsibility to make sure that they have access to as many resources as possible. And so making a decision internally because we think we just want to give them more time, actually in the long run takes away time, right? Because we haven't eliminated something from the pool of possibility, and instead we have something that's there that's potentially there, and we're delaying access to services. So I think that's a really important. I know that we want to believe that we're doing right by students in order to not put them in these spaces and positions, but we're actually denying them access. We see that happening with white families. White families are very good at getting early intervention and getting access to services quickly, and also transitioning their children out of the services. If we're really concerned about these children spending too long in special education, then our focus should be on how do we help these families understand how to transition them out of these services? How do I talk to my colleagues about how to make sure that we don't keep children in special education too long because we think that that's the better space, right? Because we think we'll care about them more. So I think we have to really address so much of the ideology that we have behind the choices that we're making, and really take a different perspective when we're making those decisions. I think earlier when Esther was talking about how how emotional it is for a family to hear, that their child has a disability. I really think it's important that we be cognizant of that, right? Many of us can really understand the experience of being at a hospital, right? And encountering a very curt doctor who just tells us, you know, well, at least this happened, right? Or, they've got this thing and it's just like a delivery of information. And that person thinks that they're being very clear, right? And they're just sharing things with us, but we know the emotional impact of that information landing. So I think understanding that people are coming to this from a place of, they're losing dreams, right? You are rearranging their entire life. You're redefining their entire role as a parent, who they are in their community. It's not just saying, I think your child needs some help, right? There's a lot more behind that. So being direct is lovely, but I think it's also important that we be kind and cognizant of what it is that we're saying to someone and what it would feel like if we were hearing that information.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that reminder too of empathy and how it would feel from our side. Yeah, thank you for that. Diana, I would like to invite you if you have anything to add on that topic. And also, I guess, somewhat related, I see there are lots of questions here about language access and language rights. And if you could speak a little bit more about what rights people have as far as being tested in their native language, particularly if it's maybe an indigenous language that's harder to find a qualified interpreter for. Some people are wondering if this is a nationwide requirement to have qualified interpreters. Yes, along those lines.
Yeah. So, um, I mean, what I rely on most commonly in terms of the qualified interpreters is the guidance from the U.S. Department of Justice and U.S. Department of Education, which is federal guidance. So it would cover the entire United States. And I put in the chat a Google Doc with a lot of these resources, including multilingual fact sheets on parent language access, use of qualified interpreters, and also addressing the needs of English learners. There is a toolkit that the U.S. Department of Education put out and I think recently updated that includes a chapter on addressing the needs of English learners with disabilities. That includes some really useful tools, I think, to, supporting, to assessing and evaluating and providing instruction for multilingual learners with disabilities. So there are some resources that are available there. In terms of access to interpreters who may speak low incidence, for students who speak low incidence languages where there might not be qualified interpreters available. Technically, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act says that the native language evaluation, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the native language evaluations are required, or the district is required to provide native language assessment unless clearly not feasible to do so. Where there are students who speak low incidence languages, the school district, this isn't a clear line rule where the district can just kind of throw their hands up and just say, well, there aren't interpreters who are going to be available to do this assessment, which we see, unfortunately. Even we have a lot of newly arrived students whose primary language is Haitian Creole in Massachusetts right now, and not really a low incidence language, but not as common as Spanish and Portuguese. And for example, and we've had districts say, oh, well, we don't have anyone, so we're not going to do it. It's really important for districts to be proactive in trying to figuring things out ways. Is there an interpreter in a different state who maybe is qualified and speaks that low incidence language? And would it be appropriate to use them even, virtually to be able to assess that student in informal ways, for example? So it is a federal requirement. And I think school districts need to really do everything that they can to make sure that they're understanding the needs of their students so that they can best support them.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I guess somewhat relatedly, I wanted to follow up with a question that Taryn put in the Q&A. She's wondering, when an IEP and ML services intercept and there isn't enough room in a student's schedule, does one trump the other? How do these decisions get made?
No, this is such a big issue. No. I mean, one doesn't trump the other. This comes up also a lot of times in terms of scheduling and planning time, because it's so important for, the English learner educator to be communicating with a special educator and the speech language pathologist oftentimes, and it's not easy in schools which may have very set schedules and limited time for that kind of common planning time. It's really something I think to figure out with the family how it can be, how this can be done. And, even considering how it can be done in the least restrictive setting. Maybe there's a way that student can be, and it depends on the individual needs of the student. So you can't have, these blanket solutions to a lot of these issues, because not all students will respond in the same ways, depending on what their individualized needs are. But would there be a way to provide some of the services that would be given in pull-out in the general education setting, or to be reinforcing some of the strategies that are happening in a different setting, in the general education setting? I'm just throwing these kind of ideas out. But it is something that I think requires teams and, school district administrators and, to really kind of stop and think, okay, what does this student need? And then take a moment, take a pause and give time to really considering how those needs are going to be met, during the school day. There is a provision for extended school day at least in Massachusetts. I think it may come from the federal law, but I'm not sure about that. But if there is more time needed and for that student to be able to access what they need, and it's appropriate given their disability related needs and their, that is another possibility, which I know brings with it complications as well, in terms of staffing and other issues.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. I also want to make sure we have enough time to talk a little bit more about creating inclusive learning spaces. And Maria, I know this is a huge topic, and we have a really broad range of people here on this webinar from elementary through high school. So I'm wondering, I'm just going to leave this very broad, but if you could just give us some strategies, some places to start when we're, as a teacher, trying to think about how to create a learning space that is inclusive for all the students.
Yeah, I think the first is just to start small and be intentional. So if you're going to decide that it's around a period in the day where everybody's learning, in a way that's different or more inclusive or more constructive, then that's fine. And really making sure that you're committing to that consistently. I think most of the things that it's interesting because I think people often want specific strategies. Like I'm going to be like, okay, so this is the thing that you do, and you do this for 15 minutes. But I really do think that the biggest thing is like you just want to give yourself time and space to try things out with your learners and to make mistakes and to revise, and to work in community with others and really focus on like what is your goal, right? What is the ultimate goal? Is the goal to build community? Is the goal to, get students to a certain benchmark? Like I think wanting students to learn things and meet benchmarks and meet goals is very, very important, right? But that's different than like, I'm gonna work and create this inclusive strategy because I want these kids to pass this test, right? I think that thinking about it in that way is important. I would say also centering students' interest. I don't know how, just it's so important. And I think we think abstractly about what that means. But I have a near and dear example from when I was a classroom teacher where I had one student who would engage in nothing in our class, if it didn't have to do with Metro cards, right? That was the only thing he wanted to talk about, think about, do, work around, engage with. And so I built a math curriculum unit around that, right? So I mapped the units that we had in our class onto thinking about Metro cards, right? And then we designed Metro cards as an art project for the students who were more interested in those things. And I think really just centering your students as people, as engaged members of the community is important. I think finding space to involve your parents is also really important. For a lot of these families, we often take our negative interactions that we may have while parents and families are experiencing a lot of information and new content, to be representations of their personalities or of the ways that they engage, right? But it's also really magical when a parent gets to go into a classroom and see how their child is being supported academically and know exactly how to map that onto the work that they're doing in their home. So I think that's another way that community also serves as strategy. And I think teachers really partnering with each other to, either find ways to create small groups of students, right, that are mixed from different classrooms. When I was a fifth grade teacher in an inclusive school, all the fifth grade teachers would teach math at the same time, and we would distribute the kids, based on the different content areas that they were working on, right? And so that was a moment in which, people traditionally would be like, oh, that's tracking. And it's like, well, no, right? Because these kids got to be with peers from other classrooms, right? With peers who did and didn't have disabilities, right? So it was a totally different type of inclusion, right? We can't just be very tunnel visioned about how we think about inclusion. And I think when we're focusing on creating inclusion and thinking about inclusive strategies is not thinking about those strategies in the dominant language only, right? Only in the English. How do we create space for students who are Mandarin users, right? Or who are Urdu users, or who are speakers of Brazilian, right? Like, how are we really letting them feel centered and seen?
Thank you. So helpful. I really appreciate going into such depth with that. We're starting to near the end, so I wanted to ask you the same question I asked Esther, you, Maria, and Diana. If there is one piece of advice you'd like to leave us with, a call of action, what would you like us to walk away from this webinar thinking about? Either one of you could go first.
I'll go first. I think I'm often really what I find really grounding is to be in a place of reflection, right? So why am I doing this work? And do I see those intentions reflected in the actions that I'm taking on, right? Whether it's for my schooling community or for my learners or for the parents that I'm working with. And then if not, what resources do I need in order to make sure that those two things match, right? What supports do I need? Does it mean that if I want to make sure that parents are feeling supported, okay, but I can't do that, right? Because I can't take on everything. Well, maybe I will bring all of the parents in my class in together for just like a lunch or a coffee hour, right? And then they can build community, right? And they can share resources. Maybe it's that I create a list at the beginning of the year of local CBOs, community-based organizations where they can seek support or places where they could ask questions first. So I think really thinking about what is it that I mean to do in this work? What is it that brought me into these spaces? How do I want to support, multilingual learners? How do I want to support students with disabilities? And making sure that our practices are actually matching our intentions.
I love that, Maria, by the way, and just those ideas, about engaging families and bringing families together in support of students. And I think along, similar lines, I think, final words would be, to really, for the needs of the student and all students and the individual student, that's in front of you, really just embrace the challenge of identifying what those needs are, finding the resources, being creative, sometimes involving families, using families as a resource in supporting, their children. They really know their children, and I've learned so much from the families that I've worked with, and I think just working together, I really do think that it's possible, to meet the needs of all students.